Hi, greetings. Mark Andrejevic coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. And I'm going to take my time today to elaborate on my concept or on the concept of automated surveillance. I'm going to build a little bit on some of the arguments that are in the article, attempt to contextualize them and extend them and connect them in ways that might move beyond what the article does. But to do that, I'm going to first say a little bit about why the concept of automated surveillance and where it comes from. Um, I thought it might be interesting to talk about automated surveillance because I think there are some logics that are associated with the use of automated media technologies for surveillance that might reconfigure some of the standard ways that we use to think about the relationship between surveillance practices and power. And I don't want to make the case that automated surveillance is somehow coming in and displacing other ways of thinking about surveillance, but rather that it exists alongside them and maybe introduces some factors that we need to think about when we attempt to understand how surveillance is operating in contemporary contexts. I get to this notion of automated surveillance in some respects by thinking about what's the sequence of events that pushes us in the direction of increasing automation. And I use this concept of cascading logics of automation to suggest that as we build automated information collection infrastructures, such as interactive systems that collect data about all types of things and people as they operate, we generate huge data troves which can only be made sense of through processes of automated data processing. Sorting the data, correlating the data, using it to discern patterns. When you have such huge collections of data, the only way to make sense of it is with automated systems. And then once you start doing that, that in turn pushes in the direction of some form of automated response. The system is discerned a pattern. It can then act or respond based on that pattern. So I call this, cascading logics of automation. You engage in automated data collection, that leads to automated data processing, and in turn to automated response. And I'll say a little bit more about that when I talk about some particular examples. The other thing that I want to say a little bit about is to elaborate on my concept of why automation, even as a category, might be a useful, potentially interesting one to think about. And that's because I think that when the decision is made to rely on automated systems, certain logics are foregrounded. I use the notion of the bias of automation to get to that notion of logics or tendencies that are embedded in technological systems that operate within particular social contexts. I borrow that term, the bias, from the work of the Canadian theorist Harold Innis, who's interested in the relationship between, at least in this formulation, between media technologies and empire and power and control. And one of the arguments that he makes is that certain media technologies have built-in affordances within particular social contexts that privilege particular modalities of the exercise of power and control. So, for example, media technologies that allow information to travel rapidly over large spaces have a bias toward control over space, to be able to send messages and control distant territories. Whereas those media technologies that are durable over time have a bias for control operating over time, for endurance. So you might think about the difference between stone tablets, which don't allow for easy message transit, but ensure that particular codes or messages last over time, versus light portable papyrus, which is not that durable, but which allows a lighter transmission of messages across space. So the claim there is that certain elements or tendencies of a control are reinforced by the material affordances of the medium. And I borrow that to make the claim that when automated media technologies are selected for particular purposes, they also carry with them particular biases. And I want to distinguish that notion of bias, of course, from the familiar notion of bias in digital systems, which tends to refer to the forms of discrimination against or toward particular groups that are embedded in algorithmic decision-making systems. So, facial recognition systems that are racially biased or biased on skin tone or gender, less likely to be more or less accurate with particular groups. Predictive policing systems that incorporate biases in historical data to over-police particular groups or neighborhoods. That's the familiar term of bias. And I'm using the notion of bias more in the sense of the technology's bias towards certain uses and certain tendencies. So the way that we might say, for example, market systems are biased towards the quantification of value and can't recognize, other forms of non-quantifiable value and so on. I hope that makes sense because I've encountered in the past some confusion when I use that term, the bias, but it's really trying to get at thinking about logics or tendencies. And these are the terms that I think of, and I think there's some more, but these are the ones I'm going to focus on for today, that I see as logical tendencies associated with the choice to use automated media systems. Preemption, framelessness, environmentality. I'm going to say a little bit about each of those in the presentation. Preemption is quite familiar. I put up this kind of parody of the Amazon anticipatory shipping patent, which I see as a preemptive logic. If you collect enough data about people, you can predict what they're going to want in advance, and then you can address those needs or actions or activities before they're expressed. So the idea here is Amazon can collect large amounts of data about consumers and use that to predict what they'll want to buy and then deliver it to them before they know they want it. So that you'd go to the door, you'd open it, there's a box, you open it up and you go, that's it, that's what I wanted. I didn't even know. I've described this as umbilicular commerce, kind of riff on the notion of the umbilical cord, right? That products are delivered to you without you having to ask. They just automatically enter the flow of consumption that leads to your front door. Other forms of preemption, I call that preemption because it kind of preempts desire, preempts your having to ask for something. It acts before the triggering moment occurs. We could also think about predictive policing as a form of preemptive activity. So predict in advance where crimes are going to happen, send patrols there, and attempt to catch the crime in process and stop it as it emerges, right? Kind of to preempt it, right at the moment when it's about to happen. So I'm going to show you a quick clip, a promotional clip for the Predpol system, the predictive policing system that was implemented in Los Angeles based on some mathematical formulas derived from a variety of sources, including measuring earthquake aftershocks and using that to kind of predict patterns of criminal activity. You're probably familiar with it, but there's a moment in it that I just want to focus on because I think it gets to this logic of preemption. So this is kind of a promotional news video about it. Hopefully, I don't hear the sound. I hope it's going into the recording. But it's using data to predict where crime is going to happen. But the moment this is, the patrol is getting their machine-generated instructions of where to go, the moment that I think is the really interesting one is when they refer, and if you've read about Predpol, this comes up over and over again. It's kind of a paradigmatic example of the logic of preemption. And it happens in Santa Cruz, California. They send some patrols to a particular area based on the machine's prediction, and they arrive just at the moment when there's an assault in progress. And the idea is there that
we came here, did extra patrols, and we were able to stop a crime in progress.
The idea is that intervention happens at the moment of emergence of the criminal activity. And I think of that as preemption, and I contrast it to logics of prevention. And I'll say a little bit about what I mean by that.
Police have a new weapon.
if prevention imagines longer term processes of cause and effect, preemption targets that moment of emergence. I can give you another example. There's a company funded in part by venture capitalist Peter Thiel, who's known for his work, his connection to Palantir, the big data processing company that has lots of military contracts. This company is meant to address an issue in the United States that regulators have not been able to address and policymakers haven't been able to address, which is, for various political reasons, which is the ongoing epidemic of school shootings. And of course, the tech folks came up with a technical solution that's meant to address the political failure. Although I don't think they would frame it that way. They think, tech just outstrips politics. But the idea is that schools would be equipped with smart cameras that can detect threats as they emerge and respond in real time. So they frame these as surveillance cameras that don't just capture what happened so that it can be studied after the fact, but that capture what's about to happen so that intervention can take place in the nick of time. And some of the promotional interviews around this highlight this temporality of preemption that I want to say a little bit about. The software can detect that a fight is about to occur milliseconds after the first punch is launched, before it even lands on the victim. So not just school shootings, but other forms of violent and threatening activity. But that moment, after this punch is launched, but before it lands, that's the temporality of emergence, right? You know it's going to happen, so you can act to stop it. But it's also a very compressed temporality. The only way to intervene in that time is in an automated way. So if you highlight that you have the ability to identify that temporality, you're also highlighting the imperative to intervene in automated, extra-human ways, right? I don't know what that would mean down the road. They don't have technology for this, but you can imagine, right? The punch is launched and then immediately some type of enforcement activity takes place. Something maybe to protect the person who's being punched or to neutralize the person who's doing the punching. Use your imagination, kind of science fiction, dystopian, automated future. So to contrast these logics of prevention and preemption, and so I use prevention in a particular way to designate a series of characteristics to contrast it to preemption. And I'm going to suggest that preemption is, in a sense, a kind of post-political tool because it doesn't rely on narratives of causality and explanation and understanding that are contested in the political realm. Instead, it takes activities to be preempted as ubiquitous emerging risks that have to be addressed in real time. So when I talk about prevention, I'm talking about the standard political model for dealing with social issues. Let's understand what contributes to those issues. Let's figure out how we want to change those issues. And then let's intervene at the level of cause and effect. So we might think about, for example, I don't know, questions of inner city crime. There was a time in the United States when there was concern about juvenile delinquencies in inner cities, and one of the presumed causes was lack of educational and recreational opportunities for young people in the cities. That's a kind of cause and effect narrative. And of course, that's a politically contested one, right? But anyway, under the Clinton administration, funding was put forward in block grants for cities to be able to provide inner city recreation and education programs for young people. And the idea was that would help prevent crime down the road. That money was later removed from those programs and sent to police departments for the development of technology, because it became, as policing became more tech intensive, it was very expensive. But so you can see the move from attempting kind of longer term horizons of prediction based on causal narratives to the development of monitoring technologies that would feed into these kind of predictive policing approaches and other data-driven forms of policing. You can see the difference. One is, I think, one I describe prevention as having a kind of narrative causal element to it, preemption having more of a correlation prediction. Use the data. Don't worry about the bigger picture of what's causing crime. We just want to find those moments of emergence of criminal activities at the moment that they're taking place and intervene at that moment. So one of the claims that I think underlies this opposition is that there's a kind of symbolic representational characteristic to prevention. It relies on some conceptualized narrative understanding of the world in order to intervene in it. Whereas preemption relies on a kind of correlational post-comprehension version of prediction to intervene. So it's not to understand the world, it's to in order to act upon it. It's to kind of measure the world in order to develop correlational patterns that can then be intervened. Kind of operate. I call that an operational response without comprehension. Right? We don't know why weather patterns might impact crime at this particular moment, but historical data says they do, so we'll send people there. It's not about understanding what caused things. It's about understanding where emergence is going to take place and intervening at that moment. So that's a somewhat longer riff on the notion of preemption. And it's going to get to what I'm thinking of as this shifting paradigm. And again, I don't want to overstate this. I don't want to say it's one paradigm replacing another, but a shift in particular ways of thinking about surveillance in particular contexts. And what I really want to do here is to think about the difference between disciplinary forms of power and preemptive models of power. And I think one of the big differences is that disciplinary power is symbolic in the sense that it relies on representational and spectacular logics that are then internalized by subjects who are caught up in these logics of representation. So think of the classic model, for example, of the panopticon. I'd argue it relies on symbolic efficiency. It relies on the spectacle of surveillance for the subject to internalize the imperatives of the watchers, right? So that's the standard panoptic model, that the subject internalizes the surveillance. But to internalize it, you have to see it. As Foucault puts it, being watched all the time from the Bentham utilitarian perspective is at once too much and not enough. It's not enough because what is important is that those who are being watched know they're being watched so that they can internalize the imperative, right? That's that familiar smile, you're on camera. There may not even be a camera there. But if you think there's a camera there and you know there are sanctions for prohibited activity, then you have to behave as if you're being watched all the time. So it takes a kind of subjective internalization of the symbolic message. And so, again, for Bentham, being watched all the time is at once too much and not enough. Too much because you don't need to be watching all the time if people think they might be being watched all the time, and not enough because in order for them to think that, they need to know that they're being watched. And I think kind of post-panoptic modes of automated surveillance actually flip that around. So instead of, it's not necessary that people know that they're being watched because that disciplinary modality is not the main emphasis of the predictive system. It's not the threat of the camera disciplines the subject into not performing whatever activity is sanctioned. It's rather that you have to watch all the time in order to know everything, in order to predict the moment of criminality that is going to inevitably happen at its moment of emergence. So the one imagines the possibility of a well-disciplined population. The other is kind of exercised on a population that's conceived differently. It will not, a population that's not understood to be receptive to disciplinary logics. Cameras will not deter these actions in a symbolic sense. They can only deter those actions if they can operate on the moment of activity in its emergence. The person approaching the school won't be stopped by old school surveillance cameras, according to this Athena company, only by a camera that is part of a chain of operations. It doesn't just capture an image, it acts. It sees what's happening and it institutes measures, closes the gates, locks the doors, alerts the authorities. Who knows? Maybe down the road, shoots a laser beam. Imagine what you want, but you see what I mean by operational versus symbolic. That's one of the contrasts that I want to draw out. And so, something else happens to what might be described as logics of simulation, I think, in this context. If you think about the Cold War model of simulation, simulation is meant to predict futures that stop anything from happening in the present. So that's a kind of deterrence model. But they stop things from happening in a sense in a passive way, right? Both players decide we better not start because we know if we do something, bad consequences will follow, and so better not to start at all. This is a slide from the 1980s movie War Games, where a computer thinks it's playing a game, but it turns out it's attached to the United States missile system, and it's about to start a nuclear war. And the way the movie ends is when the hero hacker teaches the computer that it's playing a game that has no, like tic-tac-toe, that if the other player is rational, there's no way to win. And so the computer kind of gets bored and goes, all right, you can't win this game. I don't want to play. But that's the deterrence model, right? A rational calculation based on a projected future leads to the decision not to act. The simulation model associated, I think, with preemption is more like the Minority Report model of simulation. You simulate that a crime would take place if you don't intervene actively, violently, at the moment of emergence of the activity, right? So in one case, simulation is meant to rational players stop playing. The other is their rationality isn't a factor because the actor that needs to be preempted is not amenable to those logics. So instead, you just have to predict where that emergence is going to take place and stop it. So two different logics of simulation. So what's behind the turn to preemption? A couple of thoughts on this, and this isn't, I think, comprehensive, but I think one is the ongoing breakdown of the institutions and practices that enable political responses to social issues, right? Because they rely on highly contested versions of explanation and causality, right? You need to agree, you need to get everybody to agree on what the causes of crime are in order to intervene at a policy level. And if you have ideological differences that lead to complete deadlock in terms of agreeing on those causes, whatever, guns don't cause violence, people do, so you don't need to regulate guns and so on, and then a different perspective, then you have regulatory impasse or deadlock, which moves in the direction of technological solutions, as well as a kind of neoliberal post-political preference for market over civil society solutions, which again I think is a kind of testimony to a certain breakdown of civic institutions and civic practices. There's also the notion of the kind of undisciplinable subject, kind of the view that increasingly understands these activities to be taking place by actors who are non-amenable to disciplinary logic. So it's a kind of a breakdown of the presuppositions that whether or not that's factually correct, but a ideological tendency to say no, in these cases there's no way to intervene through discipline. It has to be intervened in some other way. And perhaps along with that, as these systems break down, as this civic life becomes increasingly fragmented and fractured for reasons that are outside the scope of this talk, but connected to media likely in a variety of ways, surveillance comes in as a surrogate for trust. It displaces the forms of the role that trust-based civic institutions may have enabled in other contexts. So those are just some thoughts. It's probably much more to be said about that. Another aspect that I want to talk about and think about how it's connected to preemption is what I describe as framelessness. And I'm interested in this notion of framelessness because of the way I think it connects to logics of representation. But just to kind of give you an example of what I mean, when it comes to surveillance and monitoring and data collection, if you want to be able to predict with as much accuracy as possible, you need to have as much information as you can collect, ideally everything. Former chief technical officer of the intelligence agency from the US, Gus Hunt, who says, our goal is to collect everything and hold on to it forever, because if you want to look, and this displaces previous models of surveillance, which were based on search and winnow, because it was based on human processing information. You collect as much information as you can, and then you discard the information that is not relevant, because you need to scale it down to some level that humans can make sense of. But if you have machines doing it, you want to collect all the information because you're looking for patterns, and you want to hold on to it forever because those patterns may not be complete, because you never have complete information, but you're always collecting new information, and the new information may form a pattern with the old information that you wouldn't have seen if you discarded that old information. Ben Anderson, who writes about counterinsurgency, comes at framelessness, what I'm describing as framelessness in a slightly different way. When you look at risk as something that's ubiquitous and distributed throughout the population, that risk or opportunity, if you're thinking about other forms of monitoring, can emerge at any moment, at any time. When everything is a potential risk or potential opportunity, all of life must be known and intervened in without limit or remainder. That scope of surveillance that is limitless in its appetite for data and information. That's one way of thinking about what I mean by framelessness. Other ways of thinking about framelessness, you know what I mean, like this frame would impose some limit on the data that you capture, the uses towards which it's put, what's considered relevant for particular activities. That frame, when I say framelessness, I'm talking about kind of that those limits no longer exist. Any form of data may be potentially relevant. I'm being slightly polemic here, but you know what I mean, for any particular purpose. You don't know in advance, because the correlational system that's based on automated information processing is meant to generate unintuitable correlations. So by definition, you can't say in advance. I mean, you can in some cases, right? But again, you know what I'm saying here, right? Like, you don't know in advance if it's relevant or not until you run the analysis. Is the color of socks that you wear relevant for your political preference? Well, I can't think of any reason why it would be, but we can't know until we run the correlation and see. Who knows? Maybe there is some unintuited and unintuitable pattern that only the machine can detect. Of course, the other way to think about framelessness is also in terms of the forms of representation that accompany ubiquitous and always-on forms of data collection. And this idea is also suggested to me in part by the attempt to develop systems that can represent information in frameless ways. So think of virtual reality, right? That doesn't have a frame, or the only frame is imposed by the viewer, I suppose. Or 360-degree cameras capture everything. That seems to me to kind of push in the direction of thinking about the representational systems that would be used to capture or would be used to kind of display frameless data collection. Of course, the real ambition is a kind of limitless one. The other way to think about framelessness, of course, is data collected for one purpose for particular reasons isn't linked necessarily to that purpose, but can be used for others. That frame that would delineate, this data for this purpose also falls away. All of these kind of alternative forms of scoring, alternative credit scoring, alternative health tracking and monitoring. The idea that these startups are looking around for new ways in which data can be correlated. And also another way to think about it is there isn't any particular frame that delineates those who are potential risks or opportunities from those who are not, right? The risk and opportunity are distributed throughout the population. So this idea that everybody has some risk score and that can be calculated using these forms of data and information. And that's why you need, of course, monitoring without limit. Taken to its limit, the goal of framelessness is to kind of reproduce the world in data form so that it can be machine processed. And this is from Kevin Kelly, the founding editor of Wired magazine, writes a piece called Mirror World, and his claim is that the next platform is going to be augmented reality. And that means that all of reality itself has to be captured and redoubled in informational form. And this to me is the kind of ultimate ambition of framelessness, to recreate a map that is as big as the globe, right? You hear there the references of the Borges parable, the map in the territory, in 3D no less. You need to photograph all places and things from every possible angle all the time, which means you need to have a planet full of cameras that are always on. And of course, not just cameras, right? All of the sensors that are needed to reproduce reality if you're going to have, real augmented reality. It's an impossible ambition and a limitless one. And yet it structures these tendencies that I'm talking about. So I don't want to say this is going to happen. What I want to say is that the folks who are developing these systems and putting them to use have taken into hand technology that pushes them in the direction of this type of ambition. And the last one that I want to say a little bit about is what is this, how control operates in the contexts that I'm talking about. I've mentioned how preemption works, and I'm going to push that argument a little bit further by using this notion of environmentality borrowed from Foucault's lectures on biopolitics, where he starts to think about what he describes a massive withdrawal with regard to the normative disciplinary system, what I've described earlier as being associated with the panopticon, right? That certain normative patterns of behavior are imposed through disciplinary practices that train bodies and internalize forms of subjection. And what he's getting at, I think, with this notion of environmentality is technology is employed, it's not discipline normalization, but action on the environment. Ways in which the environment can be modulated to do what he describes as changing the terms of the game, not the player's mentality. If disciplinary power trains the bodies, but also intervenes at the level of subjectification, right? The internalization of disciplinary norms through the mentality. Environmentality doesn't do that, right? It changes the context that result in behavioral responses that don't necessarily require the forms of subjectification associated with discipline, right? So one way to think about this is, the popular version of nudge. How can you control people just by changing, you want to change their diet, move the food around in the cafeteria so it's harder to get one kind of food and easier to get another. They're not internalizing disciplinary norms at that moment. They're just kind of responding to changes in the environment. And if you can modulate the environment and customize it in order to impact behavior, you are operating in some sense in a extra subjectified or extra disciplinary modality, and what that requires, and why the term environmentality I think is an interesting one, is I think it requires environment level monitoring, capturing all the data and information about the environment, but also environment level response, which means modulating the environment, right? And I think we're moving into a world where one of the fantasies of, for example, augmented reality that Kevin Kelly talks about is to create malleable and customized environments that don't just capture information about people who move them, but also respond and react in customized and targeted ways through the actual constitution of the environment. What you see is different from what I see. The virtual space that I move in is customized to me and different from the one that you move in that's customized to you. So the environment itself is modulated. And so environmentality then, and this is pushing the Foucauldian concept, right? But it's pushing it in the direction of that modifying the terms of the game, but doing it not just at some populational level, but actually finding ways to create individually customizable environments that make it possible to intervene by changing the rules of the game, the terms of the environment, the affordances and opportunities of the environment in customized, targeted ways. And I think that's one of the directions in which these technologies are moving. You can think of simple examples. Forms of automated screening in the COVID moment, in the pandemic moment, that determine through ubiquitous sensing systems that particular individuals may have elevated temperatures, and then actually changes the course of their movement, denies access, or even guides them to particular spaces where they are separated from others, or can be quarantined, or can be interviewed and given further tests, right? The physical space will actually, that they move through, will actually respond to the information that's collected about them in order to sort them and act upon them. So I think that notion of environmentality is potentially a useful one for thinking about modulated environment, and it aligns itself. This is a quote from Masumi writing about environmentality with these logics of asymmetrical, always-on intervention. If you think about when I was talking about simulation before, in the deterrent mode, it operates on a form of kind of symmetry, each rational actor looking and imagining the actions of the others. Whereas preemption is constant asymmetry, the power of a data-equipped agent acting upon individuals in the name of risk or opportunity. We know that you might commit this crime, here are the police. We know you might want this item because we have all this information that you don't have. We know yourself better than we do. We're going to deliver it to your doorstep. And that's what's interesting to me about Masumi's formulation here. Action occurs through the regulation of environmental effects rather than the entraining of optimal sequences of action, which would be disciplinary, right? Action does not aim for homeostasis, but rather works through far from equilibrium processes, constant ongoing intervention all the time. If the Bentham utilitarian world is one in which at some kind of logical endpoint, all perfect disciplining, I know it's impossible, but the logical endpoint is that everybody behaves, then you have a kind of equilibrium outcome. Whereas the preemption one is that there's always going to be risk, there's always going to be opportunity, there's always going to be the need for ongoing forms of intervention. Crime is always going to emerge, so there's going to be a constant, whack-a-mole of capturing in its moment of emergence, right? It's kind of a post-disciplinary model. Of course, environmental level control requires environmental level information capture, which really gets us back to framelessness, the goal of totalization of perspectives, a view from everywhere. I'm trying to think of some surveillance technologies which connect with what I'm talking about, and one of them is surely, those forms of ubiquitous, always-on image collection, like the Baltimore persistent surveillance systems folks who, fly a plane capturing a high-resolution video of the entire city so that everything can be quote unquote, known or measured or captured. But I was trying to think of, what are other forms of technologies that are kind of environmental level forms of monitoring? And, this might be something for further discussion. But one of the technologies that intrigued me, and I'm not sure anything's ever going to come from it, it's this military technology that you probably may have heard of called smart dust. The idea that sensor devices could be made so small that they could float as particles of dust through the air and relay information about their position and perhaps other information that they're able to collect in relation to each other. And so that you could, one of the anticipated uses was for things like urban warfare, where it's hard to see around corners and inside houses. If you could just fill the air with these particles, they would go circulate through buildings and then would relay information about the patterns of airflow and the positions of particles that could actually map for you the solids or the spaces in those rooms, and you could actually create 3D representations of them based on the information these particles are sending. But the idea that the air itself becomes a surveillance medium, ubiquitous everywhere, no particular perspective, but allows for a reconstruction of the space itself, of the environment, that seemed to me to be kind of an environmental level monitoring technology. And you probably can think of other ones as well. So some conclusions based on this discussion. I tried to kind of develop these biases and to suggest how they interact with each other. If you want to preempt, you need as much information as possible, of framelessness. And once you collect all that information and you have this ubiquitous distributed risk, the way to act is through ongoing, modulation and intervention at the level of the environment. So a kind of sequencing also of these, or interrelationship of these biases that I've been talking about. So some concerns about this. As you can tell, my approach to this is critical, in part because I think that the technological tendencies, as I've suggested, are impossible. And it's not even, you can't collect everything and hold on to it forever. You can't reproduce the world in its entirety in data form. And it's not even clear to me that as you try to approach that, you necessarily attain the stated objectives of these technologies. One of the concerns, obviously, is that preemption has feedback effects, right? So, and the feedback effects that tend to be self-reinforcing. The more you preempt, the more you perhaps create the conditions for needing to preempt even more, the more you then need to collect more information all the time. And that information then generates new perceptions of new risks that then in turn need to be acted upon until you get to this kind of almost pathological endpoint of everything is risky. The only way to address risk is to preempt all possible risks in advance, which leads to kind of a perfected stasis that's, basically, I don't know, the end of history. And the other concern, of course, that's maybe less, big picture dystopian, but equally concerning, is that the emphasis on preemption and correlation actually displaces, as I've suggested, models of comprehension that underwrite political and policy responses. So politics itself gets displaced, and I think politics is actually what we need. And the attempt to displace it by technological means is going to actually just reproduce the very problems that we need to continue to address politically. The other thing that concerns me is the rhetoric of imminence associated with preemption. As soon as a risk is detected, it's something that can be acted upon. And therefore, it becomes, in a sense, all future events become, in a sense, imminent. And I describe that as, in a kind of, slightly punny way, as pure imminence, not with an A, but with an I. If an insurgent is detected and profiled as such, that insurgent could, who knows when, at any point, pose a threat. But if they could pose a threat at any point, that needs to be addressed now, because that point could be very soon. So it's kind of collapse of the future into the present. That reduces the time and space for deliberation and causal analysis and politics. Also, I think post-disciplinary logics have the consequences of displacing deliberation over competing causal claims with the direct intervention of asymmetrical power, right? So really, in some sense, it just relies on this claim that whoever has the power also has the accurate information. And if they're preempting, well, they must have been right. And that's in part an asymmetry of power, but it's also an asymmetry of information. These correlational systems that predict what would have happened if action wasn't taken are often non-transparent and non-reverse engineerable. This is the problem with large-scale data processing via automated systems. So those, to me, all seem to pose a challenge to what I think the underlying issue is, which is the resuscitation of politics that would address the pathologies of power. So that's my talk. I hope there's something of interest. Thanks for your time.